So the next panel is around the issue of experiences of migration, and I want to introduce all three panelists here. The first one is Aysenour Kara, who is a graduate student at George Mason University. She's a master's student in the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason, who earned her BA degree in International Relations from Uludağ University in Turkey in 2009. In 2013, she was awarded an MA in the Sociology of Religion at the Faculty of Theology at the same university. She studied at the University of Siegen as an Erasmus exchange student in Germany in 2006. She was born in Bursa, Turkey, and she moved to the United States in 2010. Previously, she was a research assistant at the Center for Turkish Studies at the Middle East Institute in DC. Her research interests include Syrian refugees in Turkey, secularization among Muslims, and Islamic intellectual tradition. Musab al-Balchi is a graduate student also at George Mason University, a Syrian refugee born and raised in Syria and now based in Fairfax, Virginia. He's an MA student in Middle East and Islamic Studies at George Mason, and he has a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Damascus. During the Syrian uprising, he, alongside other journalists, founded a media outlet that specialized in documenting human rights violations perpetrated by various armed parties in the Syrian conflict, and reporting the implications of the Syrian civil war on the livelihoods of Palestinian communities in Syria. Nana Brantuo is a policy consultant. She holds a bachelor's degree in African Studies from Howard University and a master's in Curriculum and Instruction from the University of Maryland, College Park. She is currently a doctoral student in Minority and Urban Education at UMD. Her academic interests focus on the mobility, migration, and educational experiences and trajectories of African and African descendant peoples. She currently serves on the advisory board for Bowie State University and the University of Maryland College Park's Research Institute for Scholars in Education, or RISE. Nana was formerly the policy manager for the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, one of the nation's most highly regarded racial justice and immigrants' rights organizations that focuses on African American and Black immigrant community alignment. So welcome the panel.
Hello everyone, my name is Aysenour. Today I will talk about the Syrian refugees in Turkey, and I would like to provide you a broad overview of the situation rather than focusing on one of the aspects of this highly complex issue, and therefore the outline of my talk will be as follows. First, I will briefly remind the background and the scope of the Syrian crisis. Second, I will provide an overview of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, both in terms of numbers, demographics, and education. And next, I will talk about the Turkish public opinion on Syrian refugees, how it evolved over time. I will also highlight the key issues from the perspective of refugees themselves. Finally, I will talk about the integration of process and several challenges on the spot and conclude. First, I would like to give you a very brief background information on Syrian crisis. Protests against the regime in Syria, which started on March 15, 2011, escalated into a serious conflict and subsequently into a civil war, causing a massive and dramatic flow of people from the country to neighboring countries. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees defines the Syrian humanitarian flight as the greatest migration flow of recent history. At the beginning of the crisis, Syrian population was about 22 million. As a consequence of the events in Syria, 200,000 people have died, hundreds of thousands have been injured, and around 10 million have been compelled to escape from the country or to be internally displaced to secure regions. According to UNHCR data, which are based on the registered number of refugees, a minimum of 6.4 million Syrians have escaped Syria, whereas the actual number is probably higher, taking the number of the unregistered people into account as well. As you can see in the chart, more than half of those Syrians went to Turkey, which is followed by Lebanon and Jordan. The crisis resulting from the war conditions in Syria has caused the greatest humanitarian drama since World War II. Grievingly, there is no hope for a resolution in either short or medium terms. Indicators show that the number of Syrians who escaped from Syria to neighboring countries, mainly Turkey, will increase even more until a lasting peace can be established. Turkey has 566-mile-long border with Syria. In line with international law and the universal principles of human rights, Turkey admitted Syrians by applying an open-door policy and non-refoulement principles since the beginning of the crisis. Non-refoulement simply means not returning them to Syria where they face danger. Syrians in Turkey are under temporary protection regulation. However, I will follow convention and call them refugees. It's also worth mentioning that Turkey admitted Syrian refugees without any discrimination based on ethnic background, religion, or sect. Now let's look at some statistics. Turkey hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees in the world. There are about 3.5 million Syrian refugees registered in Turkey since 2011, and this corresponds to around 4% of the population in Turkey. The population of Turkey around 80 million. And to put this number into perspective, there were 1.8 million immigrants and refugees coming to Turkey between 1923, when the modern Turkish Republic was founded, until 2011. So 3.5 million is very large by any means. The cost of hosting these refugees for Turkey has been around 25 billion US dollars so far, and the international community covered some 2%. Small portion, about 8% of Syrian refugees live in camps, and the rest are settled with their own will in big cities such as Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, and cities along the Syrian border. The majority of Syrian refugees in Turkey are Sunni Arabs, and this just reflects the fact that they make up the majority of the Syrian population. Syrian refugees in Turkey also include Kurds, Turkmens, as well as Yazidis and other minorities. In terms of demographics, 45.8% of Syrians in Turkey are female and 54% are male. 44% of the Syrians are children and teenagers under the age of 18. More than 75% of the Syrians are children and women. School-age children, which is about 1 million, and only 60% of them have the opportunity to go to a school. Of this number, 253,000 children go to the schools which are called temporary training centers, where the quality of education is not comparable to the Turkish public schools. These centers have Arabic education in accordance with Syrian curriculum. Unfortunately, the rest 550,000 children does not receive any education. At least 4,000 new teachers and 30,000 classrooms are needed for 80% of Syrian children. Only the annual cost of teachers would be more than 700 million euros. Many of Syrian children work to earn money, and they experience motivation problems due to trauma. And the urgent need of integrating those unschooled children can hopefully prevent generations to be lost. Also, it is important to note that the Syrians who migrated to Turkey mainly come from northern Syria, where traditionally the education level was low, and this is another reason for low enrollment and low attendance to schools. Now let's start by looking at Turkish public opinion on Syrian refugees. The motives of accepting the Syrian refugees formed around the religious discourses of brotherhood, hospitality, helping the less fortunate. The discourse on refugees usually refers to important events in Muslim history. For example, there are a lot of references to Ansar and Muhajirin analogy, which refers to Prophet Muhammad's migration with his followers to Medina to escape oppression in Mecca. Medians known as Ansar, which means helpers, welcomed the immigrants known as Muhajirin and shared their home, wealth, food, and for that they were praised in the Quran and Hadith, which means sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs in Turkey, assumed a big responsibility in educating and motivating the public towards social acceptance and challenging negative sentiments such as racism, especially using very popular Friday sermons as an opportunity. I studied how Diyanet used religious discourse in these sermons in a separate paper. Many trusted polls and reports in Turkey show that the majority of population did not oppose receiving the Syrian refugees into Turkey. Probably the most comprehensive survey in that regard was conducted by Hacettepe University Research Center in 2014. And according to this survey, about 65% of the population thinks that acceptance of Syrians without any discrimination regarding their language, religion, and ethical background is a humanitarian obligation on our part. In the second place, we see religious motives. 53% agrees that we admitted the refugees as our religious fraternity dictates. Also, the provocative assertion that the refugees should be sent back to their country even though the war is ongoing was supported by only 30.6% of the Turkish people, while about 58% opposed or refused. 74% of the population described the Syrians in Turkey in at least one of the following categories: people who escaped from persecution, our guests in Turkey, our brothers and sisters in religion. These results shows that religious motives play a significant role along with humanitarian motives in Turkey. And high social acceptance at the beginning was related to the assumption in the public that Syrian refugees were temporary guests. However, some recent polls after 2014 show that negative opinions increase. The conflict in Syria and in neighboring countries has no end in sight, and the resources of the government and society are getting limited. We see that more concerns are raised by the Turkish public. And another comprehensive study, Syrian Barometer, which conducted in 2017 in 26 provinces, shows that the Turkish society still displays a high level of social acceptance even after almost 7 years passed and the numbers of refugees increased tremendously. However, this social acceptance became fragile and reluctant. Nevertheless, significantly, in spite of the concerns about the coexistence with the refugees, the negative opinions do not escalate into reactionary behavior except rare instances. Turkish people still describe the Syrians as vulnerable people who escaped from violence and war. Also, 2017 surveys shows that the number of people who opted for positive sentiments of the Syrians are almost equal with those who choose negative views, such as they are quite different and foreigners. Otherization appears to be a common trend towards refugees recently. 80% of the Turkish public could not find affinity between themselves and the Syrians. And to the question of where Syrians should live, only about 8% of the Turkish respondents says wherever they want to live in. Now let's move on to the views of the Syrian refugees. One of the most important findings of the 2017 report is that more than half of the refugees are happy with their life in Turkey in spite of the struggles they are facing. Even more, 57% of the refugees perceive Turkish people as similar to themselves. On the contrary, about 62% of the Turks feel distant to the refugees. Turkish people's reluctant form of coexistence indicates there is a lack of information. For instance, Turkish people tend to think that Syrians get financial and material support through the taxes Turks pay, and they live only through the support of Turkish state. However, only 30% of them received assistance from the institution or an individual in the last year. This means the assistances are not regular, and almost 1 million refugees estimated as being employed in Turkey. In other words, Syrians have been integrated in the Turkish work life in a very short time. If you look at the graph, when asked about government services that they received, 72 satisfaction point was given to healthcare services, and their satisfaction with education services follows it with 60 point, which is also high. Moreover, 9% of them run their own businesses. In terms of future plans, a significant majority, about 67% of the Syrians want to stay in Turkey. Only 30% of them leave room for potential resettlement elsewhere, such as Germany, Sweden, Canada. Now let's move on to some analysis and conclusions based on the statistical facts presented. It's clearly difficult to touch upon every single aspect of the refugee situation in such a limited time. Turkey, having received the majority of the Syrians fleeing the war since 2011, is going through a new phase after it became obvious that there is no sight for 3.5 million people to return in the near future. Despite increasing negative sentiments, Turkey didn't witness a rise in ultra-wing, anti-immigrant political movements as it was observed in Europe and the US. However, integrating a large number of refugees poses economic, political, and social challenges. The major legal and political challenge is that the status of Syrian refugees will be in Turkey. In summer 2016, President Erdogan publicly stated the intention of his administration to give citizenship to the Syrian refugees. His remarks triggered a fierce debate on this issue, and the polls that majority of Turks opposed citizenship. When asked to the Turkish public what kind of political rights should be introduced to Syrians, about 87% support the premise that no rights should be granted. On the contrary, about 64% of the Syrians want to be granted citizenship in Turkey. There are one major obstacle in front of integration is that significant portion of Syrians do not speak Turkish. This is especially an issue for the older generation. This is a main challenge in terms of social integration between Syrians and Turks. Furthermore, it's an economic challenge as well. Even though many high-skilled Syrians such as doctors, lawyers, engineers fled to Turkey, they cannot integrate to the labor force due to the language barrier. Furthermore, there are at least perceived differences in culture. For example, 80% of Turks find Syrians not similar to them in terms of culture. Integrating a large number of refugees also poses economic challenges. The right to work for Syrians under temporary protection regulated in January 2016, however, only 10,000 joined to the workforce with permits. Between 8,000 and 1 million Syrians are employed in informal economy, which creates a problem because of exploitation of their labor. Informal labor force, already a reality in Turkey with some 35% of Turkish workforce is unregistered. Another example, the unemployment rate among young population is already high, and there are claims that cheap labor supply from refugees decreases their employment options and lower the average wages, particularly in cities like Gaziantep that has a significant refugee population. However, the number of people who lost their jobs to Syrians is very limited because Syrian refugees are employed in areas that Turkish workers would not be interested or would not agree to work for such salaries. And to come to the conclusion, even though there were for sure several mistakes and mismanagement in handling this large influx, we can say that the overall process so far went without much problems, and in that regard it's a success. A legitimate question Syrian Barometer's report raises is that why neighboring countries should agree to be main take carers and burden sharers, and if a refugee has no prospect of the return to Syria, what is the real difference between him being in Turkey, Lebanon, or France, or in Canada? Protections and security-oriented policies blur the causes for a fair burden sharing. It's also worth noting that this mostly de facto coexistence and social cohesion achieved by extraordinary sacrifices of Turkish public institution and staff serving in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here today. So as my fellows said, the Syrian war is one of the biggest human catastrophe in modern era. It has led to one of the largest migration movements since the World War II. But the impact of the Syrian war has varied on the Syrian societies due to different variables such as economic and legal status. And today I want to talk about the Palestinian refugees in Syria due to their unique unique legal status. Palestinians in Syria are not considered as Syrians as they lack citizenship, and they're not considered as Palestinians, but rather they are Palestinian refugees. They are stateless. They are given special ID where it's on the top of it, it's written permanent residency for Palestinian refugees, and they're given travel document rather than Syrian passport. Thank you. Palestinians came to Syria in 1948 after the war, after the establishment of Israel, on Palestinian lands. 70,000 Palestinians came to Syria. They settled in several geographical sites, and this later on has developed to become refugee camps. According to the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief for Organization for Palestinian Refugees, there are 12 official and unofficial camps in Syria, and there are estimated of 500,000 Palestinians in Syria by 2011. Pre-war, the Syrian refugees in Syria has equal civil rights to their fellow Syrians in terms of education, healthcare, and employment. They have the right to own properties. They have the right to open business. However, the situation after the start of the civil war has changed completely. And the legal status has become a matter of life, and it has become a vital factor in their survival. In fact, out of 12 Palestinian refugee camps in Syria, 10 of them has witnessed major military operations, and 9 of them are in devastated circumstances. They are uninhabitable anymore. Excuse my English. Palestinians in Syria at the beginning of the civil war did not take side. They did not rush to take side. But that was like the neutral position that they took was not sustained for a long time. It was a matter of time before the Syrian regime used Palestinian refugee camps to launch military operations against opposition areas. And it was a matter of time before armed opposition took over Palestinian refugee camps and transferred it to become battlefields. And that led to major destruction inside Palestinian camps and large migration movement inside Syria and outside Syria. Both parties inside the war in Syria were not in favor of Palestinian refugees. The Syrian opposition, the Syrian regime, for example, in Damascus, look at Palestinians as they are pro-opposition. And that's because the Palestinian camps were controlled by the oppositions. The Syrian regime applied retaliation acts. For example, it has besieged Palestinian camps and prevented food, medical supports, people from going in and out, and that led to major human catastrophe. It led to 180 Palestinians to die by starvation. It's also applied retaliation on checkpoints inside, in areas under control of the Syrian regime. For example, as Palestinians have specific ID, it's very easy for them to be distinguished from other fellow Syrian, and that's why it was easy for the Syrian regime to target them. Also, they have been excluded, and there are some rules in the social welfare system that has been changed, and that made it very hard for Palestinians to get into education. Harder to get into education system or in terms of employment. On the other side, the opposition in Aleppo, for example, sees the Palestinian community in Syria as a pro-regime. And that's because the Syrian regime took over control of the Palestinian camps in Aleppo and transferred it and used it to bomb other areas in Aleppo. And because of that, also opposition besieged Palestinian refugee camps, and they bombed it arbitrarily and randomly. They executed Palestinians, they arrested them, and they were just because of their ID. And because of the situation inside Syria, and Palestinians had to join the bigger migration movement, the bigger Syrian migration movement. But the situation was completely different for Palestinians. For example, as Turkey, for example, admitted 3 million Syrian refugees, it imposed a visa on Palestinian refugees from Syria. And it's impossible to get visa to go to Turkey. And that's why there is no much migration from Palestinian Syrians to Turkey. Actually, if you want to go to Turkey, people have to go illegally to sneak inside illegally, and by that they would not have the right to work, They do not have the right to rent a house. They do not have the right to transfer or get financial support from anyone. Also, the UNRWA does not work in Turkey, and the UNHCR is not willing and not accepting to take responsibility of Palestinian refugees because they are in responsibility of UNRWA, and this is what created protection gap, which they have been talking about it for the whole day today. And the protection gap is much larger than just Turkey. It includes Turkey, it includes people in Egypt, it includes people who travel to Tunisia, Algeria. It basically includes all Palestinians that just travel outside of Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, which they don't. In Jordan, which is a home of 1.3 million Syrians, Jordanians prevented any Palestinians from going into Jordanians. And if there is any Palestinians who go and seek refuge in Jordan, whether they would be returned back to Syria or they would be transferred to a specific site called Cyber City, which is a former prison. In Lebanon, Lebanon has received the largest migration from Palestinian Syrian communities. It's estimated of being 42,000 Palestinian refugees from Syria had moved to Lebanon. But things has changed at the mid of 2013. The Lebanese government started changing rules to make it very hard for Palestinians to go into Lebanon. And for example, now Palestinians cannot go to Lebanon. Palestinian Syrian cannot enter Lebanon unless he had for transit process, and he had they have 48 hours to leave the country. In Egypt as well, the situation was wasn't much clear. In Egypt, if you are coming from Damascus airport directly to Egypt, then you're allowed to enter. But if you are coming from any other airport, then you're not allowed to enter. And if you are entering Egypt, you're not allowed to be registered as refugee, but rather you are registered as a tourist. And that's all. This all confusion. It's just because Palestinian refugees do not have citizenship. Nobody wants to take the risk of taking people who are stateless because they have uncertain future, rather and different than the Syrian refugees who have Syrian citizenship, and that grants them to go back to Syria. And because of this situations, that Palestinians have started to follow to Palestinians start to go to Europe. It is their final stop and it's their final option. It is very costly, it's very hard to go there, but it is the only option. As the surroundings area are not receiving you, then this is the only option. And to go to Europe, it requires very high risk trip and very high expenses. The very high risk trips, it includes leaving from southern of Syria to north of Syria to cross the borders of Turkey, and this is all dangerous, and then take a boat and go to Europe, or going from Syria to Sudan, and from Sudan to smuggle to Libya, and from Libya to take boats and trip of 12 days or less to reach to Italy. And these are very risky trips, and also it requires up to $8,000 per person, and this is very large amount of money that most of Palestinians cannot able to afford. However, it's being reported that 100,000 Palestinians had reached Europe by the end of 2016, and this is a very large number. So the bottom line of the situations for Palestinian refugees in Syria is that they are being treated differently inside of Syria. They are not being favored by any kind of these groups, and the situation start to be discriminated against. Plus, their houses has been destroyed, and they have been removed, uprooted from their communities, and their houses and communities have been destroyed by the military operations. And the neighboring countries are not willing to receive them because of the high risk of receiving them. So that's why we really need to think about the Palestinian situation in Syria as part of the bigger situation. It's part of the move, like the situation that started in 1948. It has been for 70 years, and this Syrian situation is a continuation of what the Syrian-Palestinian situation is a continuation of what happened 70 years ago. It happened before with other Palestinian communities in Kuwait, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Jordan before, and now it happened with Palestinians in Syria. And it may happen in the future with other Palestinian community, especially if we take into consideration that the political systems in the Middle East are not well found, and there is in any moment there would be social unrest or political unrest would take place. There is need to solve the Palestinian situations, and that would start at the beginning of world integration of Palestinian communities and the stop of this discrimination and like based on ID or like whatsoever on Palestinian refugees. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I am the last person. Thank you all for sticking it out. I know it's been a long day, but a very productive day. I've learned a lot. I hope you all have well. Please don't mind the 43 out here. I'm not going to go through every single slide. So we can just jump right into it. So my full name is Nana Brantuo. My father's from Ghana. My mother's from Sierra Leone. Her father's from Guinea. Her side of the family are Muslims. My father's side are Christians. So just a big sort of mix in terms of ethnicity, nationality, religion, and sort of what brought me to this space and to this work. I think it's really important to be looking at the intersections of immigrant or migrant identity. And I find, especially for Black immigrants living in the United States, but throughout the West, really, there are ways in which multiple parts of our identities are erased, which is very troubling and problematic because it it actually really skews our understanding of the experiences of Black migrants and Black immigrants in this place, which is what sort of brought me to this work and to this presentation, which is entitled Living at the Crossroads, Anti-Black Racism, Xenophobia, and the State of Black Immigrants in Trump's America. So when I say anti-Blackness, and sometimes people are like, what is that? Like, it's very heavy for a lot of people, or they're fearful of even saying it. Sometimes people are even fearful of saying Black because, especially within this context, because they know it's going to bring us into a deeper conversation around racism. But nonetheless, we have to have the conversation because it is a real thing, a real phenomenon that impacts people every day. And also, let me make sure I'm looking at my clock. So when I say anti-Blackness, and I pulled this quote from Dr. Michael Jeffries, and he was writing in response to protests that were happening in Ferguson. And he said, racism is a combination of prejudice, discrimination, violence, and institutions that reproduce racial inequality and injustice regardless of intent. Our schools, neighborhoods, and criminal punishment system actively privilege whites at the expense of people of color, even when the rules governing these systems are racially neutral. So that's the overall broad definition of racism. But when it comes to anti-Blackness entails all this and more. It is not simply about hating or penalizing Black people. It is about the debasement of Black humanity, utter indifference to Black suffering, and the denial of Black people's rights to exist. And I think it's very telling, especially during this age of protest, uprising, to really get at this anti-Blackness that comes because we've all been socialized to be anti-Black, no matter what part of the world we're coming from, really. And I think it sort of plays off of what was presented earlier on white supremacy and as well as ableism as impacting the U.S. migration system. It sort of is what makes us question a young Tamir Rice in terms of why he had a fake toy gun, as opposed to why was a police officer so fearful of a young Black man that he was shot to death. It sort of shifts everything, like your humanity is always at question. Your morality is always at question, even though it's circumstances that should be looked at a much larger level. So when I speak specifically to immigration, I'm talking about laws, policies, protocols, and procedures that systematically and institutionally restrict the mobility and movements of Black people. Within this, or examples of this, which feed into other groups, but look very different for Black immigrants, and I'll get into this later on, is overall reduction of admission of Black immigrants into the United States for both immigrant and non-immigrant visas. And in particular, when we're talking about Black immigrants, but we're also talking about migrants from the Middle East and North Africa and from Muslim majority nations, we're also just seeing this restriction on refugees, asylum seekers, and family reunification. There's also increased measures to deport undocumented Black immigrants that often isn't discussed as much as well, which feeds into this overall erasure, which is very problematic, but and very telling of the anti-Blackness in and of itself. When people think a Muslim immigrant, they never think of a Black person. When people think of a refugee or an asylum seeker, there's never the thought that this person could possibly be Black. I mean, even like I remember being in spaces within higher education and having to explain how, yes, it is possible to have a Black immigrant. For a lot of people, I think Black is exclusively African American. And even in that, there's a deeper history of migration that's been long-term of Black people to the United States. And there's actually a lot of notable Black people are either immigrants or children of immigrants, like a Cicely Tyson, who was born in Nevis, that a lot of people don't know, or Malcolm X, whose mother was from Grenada. Like a lot of migration has happened that has diversified and continues to diversify the Black population here. So just a bit of a historical overview, and I would be remiss to not talk about 1619, which is when the first enslaved Africans arrived to Virginia and Jamestown, but also the Naturalization Act of 1790, which restricts naturalization to free white persons, specifically free white men. It's important to keep all of these things in mind, as well as Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857, case law, which established that persons of African descent cannot nor were ever intended to be citizens under the U.S. Constitution. So while we're talking about restrictions of the mobility of Black people, we're also talking internally within the United States, where the overall rights of African descendant people are disregarded. So for me, pictures are always important. I always want people to see, like, yes, this is something that's been happening. A lot of these pictures came from the Schomburg Center in Harlem, which is named after Arturo Schomburg, who was a Puerto Rican immigrant to the United States before Puerto Rico was essentially a colony. And he is a man of African descent who's largely responsible for the documentation of Black histories throughout the Americas, really. More pictures. There's a community of Bahamian immigrants that still live in Florida, about 4 or 5 generations in. Cuban immigrants. I also making sure I want people to, like, when you see these Spanish surnames, yes, we have Black peoples that are migrating from Latin America, because sometimes too, that's also a lot for a lot of people to hold, that yes, you can be Black and also be Latinx or Latino or Latina. I love this picture because I just never would have thought that this would happen in 1902. You had a group of Ethiopian immigrants coming into New York City. More legislation. By now, we're talking about the 13th and 14th Amendments, which are still highly disregarded until about 1964 with the Civil Rights Act in 1965, sort of ushers in a new period of migration to the United States that now allows people from previously barred zones, the Asiatic zone in particular, but also sub-Saharan Africa, admission into the United States. This is a group of women from Guadeloupe. A lot of their pictures are very famous if you go online and look through archives as well, because a lot of them migrated in their traditional dress, very colorful, very much Creole style of the French Caribbean. Cape Verdean immigrants as well, they are going much further up north, largely because of the whaling industry that was very prominent during that time. Cape Verdeans also whale as well on their island, which is off the coast of West Africa. A famous immigrant or child of immigrants from Madagascar, who was responsible for penning the lyrics to like popular jazz and blues tunes, but most specifically Black and Blue and Ain't Misbehaving. A lot of people don't know that. Arturo Schomburg, who I brought up earlier, a Puerto Rican migrant, once again, making sure too that we also see women's faces as well. Women and men are migrating through time. Black women and Black men. Another son of migrants. So that was like a historical, but in terms of contemporary, and I'd also be remiss to not talk about the British West Indies Temporary Worker Program. A lot of the time when people talk about labor migration, Black folks are also excluded from that conversation. I think a lot of people think Bracero program of Mexicans who were brought to do agricultural work into the United States, but West Indians were brought as well, largely from Jamaica, Barbados. It was Jamaica, Barbados, and the Bahamas. And these are some pictures of some of them being brought to the United States and going into work. Also students as well. And a lot of my focus is on student migration, so I've been reading a lot about Africans who are coming to the United States for graduate education specifically to return to their nations of origin to then sort of take over governance following colonization. But when we talk about this new wave of Black immigrants from like 1940 to present, we're talking about a lot of that is caused by liberation movements in the US, different legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the Immigration and Naturalization Act. Also just overall US interference in other people's governments, which is, I mean, it just is what it is. So we're talking about Haiti, Grenada, Panama, Dominican Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo. I mean, and even till this day, those ramifications are still felt. I think it was fiscal year 2016 that the largest number of refugees in this country came from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Once again, it's this continued sort of interference, continued disruption, which feeds into a political and economic turmoil throughout these regions. So this is the signing of the Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1965, which opens up a way for people of color in particular to migrate here. And then we do see this increase, but with this increase, which is typical of history, once this nation starts to look browner, there are fears of, I guess, doing what is like really disrupting the power structure, disrupting what's comfortable, what's considered normal. If you're migrating here, and I mean, I think our president did a very good job of letting us know how he felt of Black and brown people. Also, women, folks with disabilities, any group we can name it, we know, right? But it's during the late 20th century that we then see immigration reform laws that basically make it easier to deport people because there's an expansion in terms of the terms that make people deportable in terms of felonies, and the category of felonies is expanded. And this impacts Black and brown migrants disproportionately because you're already you're in neighborhoods, you're in cities, you're in municipalities that are already hyper-policed, that are hyper-surveilled, and you're coming in with this skin color, for Black immigrants in particular. And there's a whole history of that in this country. If you're Black, you're instantly thought of as criminal, or people are ultimately, once they meet you, they have biases, right? And I think we're in a room of educators, so I think folks should be familiar even with research that has talked about unconscious bias and how it shows up in classrooms. It is what we have because that's what we're socialized within this country. So I think one of the most important things is to actively think through that, remember that, and just do the work to unlearn that. But just in terms of overall demographic breakdown, so we have nearly 5 million Black immigrants that live in the US. That's 10% of the Black population, and that's almost 9% of the US foreign-born population. Thank you. 11% of this foreign-born Black population identifies as Latino or coming from Latin America. You also have close to 600,000 Black immigrants that are living in the US without documentation. Either they came without documentation, period, or their status expired. I also move away from saying illegal. I don't like that terminology. I prefer undocumented. So 16% of all Black immigrants and 5.3% of all undocumented immigrants are Black. So regions of origin, largely Caribbean, that's historical, obviously because of proximity, right? And there wasn't a restriction in terms of West Indian migration to the United States as there was for Sub-Saharan Africa. But from like 1990 to now, that African immigrant population has probably quadrupled. More people have been migrating here. They've had more access to come here. You have about 8% coming from South and Central America and about 2% from Europe. And the top countries of birth, or the top 10 nations, are Jamaica, Haiti, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Trinidad and Tobago, Ghana, Guyana, Kenya, the Dominican Republic, and Somalia. And later down, it chooses Liberia, Cameroon, Barbados, Mexico, Eritrea, Panama, Grenada, Cuba, the Bahamas, and Sierra Leone. And this is just overall geographic dispersion. If I was to change up the ways, like if I was just to look at major metro areas, in terms of African immigrants, our area would be like second to New York in terms of African immigrants that are here. And I was actually looking at some numbers before I came to present today, but in terms of the refugees that are resettled in Virginia and Maryland, there are a large number of people that come from Democratic Republic of Congo. It's like third to Syria and Iraq. So there's also this large population of people who are here that, because they're Black, maybe people don't always readily say, oh, they might be coming from a nation that's dealing with some sort of political turmoil. These are people who are refugees or asylum seekers. So that's always something to be mindful of, that yes, we are here. This is a breakdown of the ways in which people enter the United States in terms of legal permanent residency, and almost 30% of these people are refugees and asylees. 10% on a diversity base or diversity visa lottery, though it's not really a lottery, it's extremely vetted. You have to be very well educated and have access to all sorts of resources to even apply. And just because you apply does not mean that you gain admission. And a lot of people are family sponsored, and we see that the administration has sort of taken a stance on family reunification and calling it chain migration, despite having a wife who is an immigrant whose parents who are here because they were sponsored by their daughter. It's very interesting how it works. Some issues, and then I think I'm gonna wrap it up because I don't wanna take too much time. Thank you. So highly educated. When the president made these shithole country comments, everybody was rushing to say, yes, Black immigrants are highly educated, which was interesting to me because I don't think the amount of education that you have should be sort of the basis of how I understand how you're valued. So I didn't really like that. I also didn't appreciate the countries where my parents are from being called shithole countries. I don't like that. I think it's disrespectful. But we're in an era that lacks diplomacy within that regard. We're also seeing trends that impact African Americans, impact Black immigrants, and that just goes without saying. When it comes to income, Black immigrants make less annual income compared to citizens and non-citizens, period. 1 out of 5% of Black immigrants live below the federal poverty line, And all of this is pulled from census data. The Black Alliance for Just Immigration released the report, the State of Black Immigrants report, that also has a lot of this information as well, if you'd like to access it. Mass criminalization, which is also real. It stems from the 13th Amendment, which has that just very convenient sort of loophole in saying no slavery unless you've been charged of a federal crime, right? So we'll see that more than one out of every 5 non-citizens that faces deportation on criminal grounds is a Black person. And 1 out of every 5 immigrants detained while facing deportation on criminal grounds is Black as well, which feeds into neighborhood policing and surveillance, which is historical, whether it's Washington, D.C., whether it's New York City, whether it's spaces like in Minnesota, where there's a large Somali population and there already is this focus on circumventing any sort of radicalization within this population. So we're seeing trends that have been here before, but it looks different now because we're talking about immigrant people. We're also, and this is also visa concern, when you look at the peoples who apply for B visas to the United States, which is the largest visa category, it's for temporary visits. The discrimination is always highly towards people coming from nations with significant Black populations. Fiscal year 2016, Cuba was at the top. About 9 or 10 more of these nations were nations with Black majorities. And largely, the reason that's provided is that we don't want people who are going to overstay their visa and not return, which is fascinating to me as well, because if you look at the Department of Homeland Security's data, the majority of people that overstay their visas are Canadian. Like a large percentage. Like very large, you know? So once again, too, like one can't help but think that there are some sort of racialized undertones to this, that when you see the applicant that is of Canadian of origin as opposed to maybe a Ghanaian visa applicant. Like, it's very interesting looking at the data, and it's hard to not say that this might have something to do with the racialization that is the United States of America. So I just want to wrap it up and talk about just current things, and this applies to all groups of people. Temporary protected status, which is granted to people who are coming from nations that have experienced extreme yet temporary disruptions, whether that's epidemic, whether that's a natural disaster, whether that's conflict. Syria was also one of the nations that was granted temporary protected status. It was reauthorized. DACA was talked about, diversity visa programs talked about briefly. Visa sanctions, less talked about 4 different nations, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State placed sanctions on, in which it restricted migration of people in terms of temporary visas totally for people coming from Eritrea, which is an African nation, majority black nation, also a majority Muslim nation as well. So there's a lot of intersection with how these policies impact people. Denaturalization, which was lightly talked about as well. There's been an operation by the Department of Justice to denaturalize people, and a lot of these people are tending to be black and brown people, largely Muslim people. There are trends that are just showing up that are just pointing us to a xenophobia that is grounded in racism and Islamophobia as well. Increased ICE raids, and also increased detention and deportation. So yeah, like there's just been an incredible increase in those people who have been detained and deported. And there's also been a growth in 287G programs, which deputizes, I know I'm taking up a lot of time, but the 287G program, which deputizes police officers to take out and enforce immigrant actions or immigrant enforcement, which is already problematic. Like there's an intersection of policing and then immigration enforcement, and this makes communities scared with reason, whom already don't trust the police. So these are some of the intersections of a lot of the different policies that I touched on lightly. I could answer questions if people have them, but I just wanted us to take note of the different countries that are listed out within these spaces. And I think a lot of that gets erased in the conversation, that a lot of these are nations that are what people are coming from, that are majority black nations, that are African nations mostly, with the exception of Haiti, which Haiti already has a very interesting relationship with the United States in terms of foreign policy. So just to end, these were some of the quotes that sort of framed and I'm pretty sure Donald Trump is not the only person in the White House who has ever thought this. And I know he's not. We all know it's not. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this was already said, and it sort of forms the basis of how policy is being formed, and agendas are being formed, and what's being passed and what's not being passed. And so I just kind of wanted to leave it with an ending question. What do we want immigration to look like domestically and internationally within the 21st century? Thank you.